The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted like broken promises, a fine, gritty powder that settled on everything, from the brim of a man's hat to the deepest corners of a woman's heart. Thomas Blackwood stood with his hand resting on the shoulder of his 5-year-old son, Leo, a man carved from the same hard rock and lonely plains as his ranch, his face a mask of stoic indifference that had taken years to perfect. The stagecoach had just arrived, kicking up a fresh cloud of that bitter dust, and with it, a fresh delivery of misery and hope in the form of 5 mail-order brides. They were pale, nervous women, blinking in the brutal sunlight. But then a 6th figure emerged, helped down by a rough-looking man in a city suit. She was Chinese, her traditional silk dress, the color of a fading sunset, stained and torn at the hem. Her eyes, wide and terrified, scanned the hostile crowd, a doe caught in a ring of wolves. Thomas's gaze passed over her, indifferent, another piece of human cargo in this brutal land. But his son, Leo, saw something else. The boy's small body went rigid. He lifted a trembling finger, his voice piping and clear, a silver bell in the dusty silence. "Papa," he cried out, his voice ringing with the pure, unshakable certainty of a child. "That's my mama." The word struck the air and shattered the afternoon's quiet. Every head turned. Every whisper died. For Thomas Blackwood, the world didn't just stop, it fractured into a million pieces. The ground beneath his worn leather boots seemed to vanish, and all that was left was the sight of the terrified woman in the ruined silk dress, and the impossible words of his son echoing in the ruins of his heart. He froze, a statue of a man whose carefully constructed world had just been leveled by a child's cry. The silence that followed Leo's declaration was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Thomas felt the weight of every stare, the townsfolk's curiosity turning from the new arrivals to him, their resident recluse, the man whose heart was rumored to be as barren as his furthest pasture. He looked down at Leo, whose face was alight with a joy Thomas hadn't seen in years, a pure, radiant hope. Then his gaze lifted, crossing the dusty space to the woman. Her name was a ghost on his tongue, a word he hadn't allowed himself to speak in 5 years. Mai. Her eyes, the color of a summer storm just before it breaks, were locked on him, and in their depths, he saw a maelstrom of terror, recognition, and a sorrow so profound it stole his breath. The man beside her, one of the guards who smelled of cheap whiskey and authority, sneered. "The boy's mistaken," he said loudly, his hand clamping down on Mai's arm. She flinched, a small, wounded motion that sent a white-hot spike of something fierce and protective through Thomas's frozen veins. He took a step forward, his voice emerging from his throat like rocks grinding together. "What is your name?" he asked, the question directed at her, though his eyes burned into the guard. Before she could answer, the guard yanked her arm. "She's got no name for you, rancher. She's cargo." Property of Mr. Sterling. Mai's mouth opened, a silent plea, but no sound came out. She was a portrait of anguish, her entire being screaming a story she could not tell. The guards began to herd the women toward the town's only hotel, pulling Mai along with them. She looked back over her shoulder one last time, her eyes a desperate, drowning plea aimed directly at Thomas. He remained rooted to the spot, his son's small hand now clutching his, the impossible hope in the boy's eyes a stark contrast to the cold, familiar bitterness coiling in his own gut. She had abandoned them. That was the story he had lived by. It was the foundation of the fortress he had built around his heart. But as he watched them drag her away, a woman who looked less like a betrayer and more like a prisoner, the first crack appeared in that foundation. The room was a cage gilded with faded velvets and dark, heavy wood. It was the finest suite in the Redemption Gulch Grand Hotel, but to Mai, it was just a more opulent version of the prison she had known for the last 5 years. A guard stood posted outside her door, a constant, looming reminder that she was not a guest, but a possession. From her window, she could see the vast, endless prairie stretching to meet the sky, a cruel mockery of the freedom she craved. How could a land so wide and open hold so much captivity within it? Her hand went to a small, hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her dress, her fingers closing around the worn, smooth contours of a small wooden bird. Thomas had carved it for her during their first spring together, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he shaped the tiny creature. He had told her it was a meadowlark, a bird whose song promised new beginnings. It was all she had left of him, of the life that had been stolen from her. Her mind, a vessel of trauma, replayed the fragmented memories. The sweet, milky smell of her newborn son. The chillingly calm voice of her father in San Francisco, telling her the baby had been born still and that Thomas, the American rancher, had sent word he would not be back. The lie had been a blade that had expertly severed her from her own life. Then came the contract, the debt, the passage on a ship not as a wife, but as property, sold to a cruel and powerful man named Sterling. For 5 long years, she had believed her son was in heaven and the man she loved had betrayed her. Then, today, in a dusty street, a miracle had shattered her despair. She had seen him. Her son. Alive. And in that moment, seeing the hardened stranger Thomas had become, a new, more potent agony was born, the agony of a truth that might never be heard. Thomas rode his horse hard, the rhythmic beat of its hooves against the dry earth a futile attempt to outrun the chaos in his own mind. Back at the ranch, the silence was a physical presence. He moved through the familiar motions of the evening, mending a fence, watering the stock, cooking a simple meal, but his mind was 1,000 miles away, trapped in that dusty street, staring into a pair of storm-colored eyes. He put Leo to bed, the boy's small frame curled up under a heavy quilt. "Was that really Mama?" Leo whispered, his voice drowsy with sleep but laced with a child's unwavering faith. Thomas's throat tightened. "Go to sleep, son," he managed to say, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. For 5 years, the narrative had been simple, brutal, and clean. Mai had left. She had seen the hardship of a rancher's life and chosen the comfort of her wealthy family in San Francisco. The letter had been polite, cold, and final. It had shattered him, but from the pieces, he had rebuilt himself into someone who needed no one, a man whose only vulnerability was the small boy sleeping in the next room. He had packed away her memory like he had packed away her belongings, in a dark, locked place. But now, Leo's words had picked that lock. After the boy was asleep, Thomas walked to the old sea chest at the foot of his bed. The lid creaked open, releasing the faint scent of cedar and dried lavender. Beneath a set of his mother's linens lay a small, leather-bound box. He opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a smiling, vibrant Mai, her head tilted back in laughter, and beside it, a single, tiny leather bootie, worn soft from a foot that had never learned to walk on its own. He picked up the photograph, his thumb tracing the curve of her smile. The woman in the picture was full of light and love. The woman in the street was a ghost, haunted by a sorrow he couldn't comprehend. The anger that had been his constant companion for half a decade began to feel thin and brittle, a poor shield against the agonizing possibility that the story he had built his life upon was a lie. Desperation was a sharp-edged stone in Mai's throat. She knew she could not wait for Sterling's men to move her again, to some other, more permanent prison. She had to act. That evening, she feigned a sudden, violent illness, crying out and collapsing to the floor. The guard, a hulking man named Lars, was hesitant but eventually sent a boy to fetch the town doctor. When Dr. Abe arrived, he was an island of gentle calm in her sea of terror. He was old, with kind, wrinkled eyes that seemed to see far more than what was on the surface. He shooed the nervous guard out of the room, insisting he needed privacy to examine his patient. "Let the girl breathe, man," he'd grumbled, closing the door firmly. Alone with her, his professional demeanor softened. He didn't press her for details, but as he took her wrist to check her pulse, his thumb brushed over the dark, fingerprint-shaped bruises on her arm, hidden beneath her sleeve. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not judgment, but a deep, weary understanding. "The body keeps a record of our sorrows," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. He saw the frantic terror she was trying to conceal. He saw the truth. He spoke to her of his own late wife, of the courage it took to endure in a world that was often unkind. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, child," he told her, his gaze steady and reassuring. "It's acting in spite of it." Before he left, he placed a small, dark bottle on her nightstand. "Laudanum, for the pain," he said, but as he stood at the door, he gave her a look of profound meaning. It was not just a medicine. It was a key. A chance. An unspoken offer of alliance from the first kind soul she had met since her world had been torn apart. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar feeling, began to flutter in her chest like the wings of a trapped bird. Martha, the proprietor of the Redemption Gulch boarding house, was a woman built of straight lines and sharp angles. She ran her establishment with an iron will and had no tolerance for scandal or riffraff. She'd heard the whispers about the new Chinese woman and the scene with Thomas Blackwood and his boy. In Martha's ledger of life, things were either respectable or they were not, and this whole affair was decidedly not. Her opinion, however, began to shift the following morning. She was sweeping her front porch when she saw Lars, the guard, dragging Mai from the hotel. Mai had apparently tried to step outside for a breath of fresh air, and Lars was making a public spectacle of her punishment, his voice a low snarl as he shoved her back towards the door. Martha saw the look on Mai's face, not defiance, not shame, but the pure, unadulterated terror of a hunted animal. That sight offended Martha's core, a deeply buried but fiercely held sense of justice. This wasn't a fallen woman causing a scandal, this was a brute tormenting a victim. The moral arithmetic in her head recalculated. That night, a storm rolled in, the pathetic fallacy of the heavens weeping for the town's injustices. A frantic, tapping sound at her back door cut through the rhythm of the rain. When Martha opened it, a cloaked and soaking figure stumbled inside. It was Mai, her face pale, her eyes wild with fear. She had used Dr. Abbe's laudanum, not on herself, but in the guard's evening coffee. She had only a few precious hours. "Please," Mai whispered, the word a ragged breath. "He will kill me when he wakes." "Please, you must hide me." Martha looked at the trembling young woman, no older than her own daughter who had died of fever. The stern matriarch, the pillar of town respectability, made a decision. She saw a human being in desperate need of sanctuary. She pulled Mai inside, shot the heavy bolt on the door, and said with a voice that tolerated no argument, "The Lord despises a bully. You'll be safe here. No one will find you." Thomas couldn't shake the image of Mai's face from his mind. The story of her abandonment had been a simple, solid thing, but now it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He rode back into town the next day, a man possessed by a single, burning need, the truth. He found Lars, the guard, nursing a headache and a foul temper in the saloon. Thomas didn't bother with pleasantries. He cornered the bigger man near the back, his movements quiet and deadly, the controlled rage of a patient man finally pushed too far. "I want to know about the woman," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. Lars scoffed, trying to push him away. "I told you, she belongs to Sterling." "She ain't your concern." But Thomas was not the same man he was 2 days ago. The walls around his heart were crumbling, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. He slammed Lars against the wall, the impact rattling bottles on a nearby shelf. The saloon went quiet. "She is my concern," Thomas growled, his face inches from the guards. "I want to know how a woman from San Francisco ends up as property in a town like this." Fear flickered in Lars's eyes. Under the pressure of Thomas's unyielding grip and the threat of violence that hung unspoken in the air, the man's bravado cracked. "It was a contract," he spat out, "a desperate confession. Her old man, a big shot in the city, owed Sterling a fortune. He signed her over to settle the debt. A contract of indenture. She didn't leave you, rancher. She was sold." The word hung in the air, ugly and obscene. Sold. Not a choice. Not a betrayal. A transaction. The entire foundation of Thomas's bitterness, his pain, his isolation, was obliterated in that single, horrific word. He released Lars, who slumped to the floor. Thomas stumbled back, the truth a physical blow. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been a fool, nursing a wounded pride while the woman he loved had been living a nightmare. His grief was now dwarfed by a tidal wave of guilt. The journey from the saloon to Martha's boarding house was a blur of dust and dawning horror. A stable boy, sympathetic to Thomas's frantic questioning, confirmed he'd seen a cloaked woman slip through Martha's back door during the storm last night. Hope and dread warred within him as he raced to the respectable establishment, Leo held tight in front of him on the saddle. He didn't knock with anger or accusation, but with the desperate plea of a man praying for a miracle. Martha opened the door, her stern face giving nothing away, but she stepped aside to let them in. And then he saw her. Mai was standing by the hearth, pale and trembling, but safe. Their eyes met across the room, and in that gaze, 5 years of pain, misunderstanding, and loneliness collapsed into a single, heart-stopping moment. But it was Leo who broke the spell. He slid from Thomas's arms and ran, his little boots thudding on the wooden floor. "Mama," he cried, launching himself into her arms. Mai sank to her knees, a sob tearing from her chest as she wrapped her arms around the child she had thought was dead. She buried her face in his hair, her tears of anguish finally turning into tears of cathartic release. Holding her son, with Thomas watching, the dam of her silence finally broke. The words poured out of her in a long torrent of grief and truth. She spoke of her father's treachery, of his lies about Thomas's abandonment and their son's death. She recounted how he, shamed by her marriage to an American laborer and desperate to cover his gambling debts, had signed the indenture contract with Mr. Sterling, effectively selling his own daughter into servitude. "I thought he was dead," she wept, clutching Leo tighter. "They told me my baby was in heaven. Every day, for 5 years, I mourned a son who was alive." Thomas sank into a nearby chair, the weight of her story crushing him. His own pain seemed selfish and small compared to her profound suffering. He had cursed her for leaving, while she had been weeping for a dead son and a lost love. The guilt was a physical agony. He crossed the room and knelt before her and their child, his own tears finally falling. "Mai," he choked out. "Can you ever forgive me?" The fragile peace of their reunion was shattered by the sound of heavy boots on Martha's porch and a fist hammering on the front door. Lars and the other guards, their authority bolstered by a corrupt town sheriff in Sterling's pocket, had discovered Mai's hiding place. "Open up, Martha!" Lars bellowed. "We know she's in there. She's stolen property." For a moment, stark terror seized Mai again. But then something shifted. Thomas stood up, no longer a man broken by guilt, but one forged anew by purpose. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You are not property," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that was absolute. "You are home." He turned to face the door, but before he could reach it, he realized he was not alone. The story had spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire, carried on the winds of gossip but fueled by the undeniable truth of a mother's reunion with her son. Dr. Abe had spoken to the blacksmith. Martha had confided in the mercantile owner's wife. The whole town had watched Thomas Blackwood, the hermit, transform into a man fighting for his family. When Lars and his men finally broke the door open, they weren't met by a scared woman and a lone rancher. They were met by a wall of silent, determined townspeople. The blacksmith stood in the hall, a heavy hammer in his hand. The mercantile owner and his son stood on the stairs. The women of the town, who had once whispered judgment ally, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Martha, their faces set like stone. The community, once a chorus of suspicion, had become a fortress of protection. Thomas stepped to the front, Mai and Leo directly behind him. He looked at Lars, not with hatred, but with a calm, unshakable certainty. "She is not going anywhere," he said, his voice carrying over the tense silence. "This is her home. This is her family. You and Mr. Sterling have no power here. Leave this town, and do not come back." Faced with the united defiance of an entire community, the guards faltered. Their power was built on fear and isolation, and in that room, there was only courage and unity. With a final, impotent glare, they retreated, their blustering threat swallowed by the quiet strength of good people making a stand. In the days that followed, a fragile sense of peace settled over the boarding house. The threat of Sterling's men lingered, but the town's protective embrace was a powerful shield. Then, the Deus Ex Machina arrived, not with a clap of thunder, but with the quiet efficiency of the telegraph wire. The sheriff, his loyalties now firmly swayed to the side of his own community, delivered the telegram to Thomas himself. It was from a federal marshal in San Francisco. A massive corruption and trafficking ring, run by the influential Mr. Sterling, had been exposed and dismantled. A key witness, a wealthy merchant on his deathbed, had given a full confession, naming names and detailing crimes. That witness was Mai's father. In his final act, he had sought to undo one of his greatest sins, specifically detailing the fraudulent indenture contract for his own daughter. With Sterling's empire in ruins and the contract legally nullified, Mai was, unequivocally, a free woman. The news was met not with loud celebration, but with a deep, collective sigh of relief. The storm had finally, truly passed. The final scene was not one of dramatic confrontation, but of quiet, profound beauty. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting a warm, golden light over Thomas's ranch. The three of them stood on the porch, a family whole for the first time. Mai leaned against Thomas, his arm securely around her, while Leo chased fireflies in the growing dusk, his laughter the purest sound in the world. The years of pain and separation were not forgotten, they were scars that testified to their survival. Thomas looked at Mai, his eyes full of a love that had weathered the cruelest of storms and emerged stronger. He was no longer the wounded guardian, isolated by his bitterness, and she was no longer the broken survivor, defined by her trauma. They were simply a family, their future as open and vast as the sprawling prairie before them, a testament to a love that, against all odds, had found its way back home.